Rage Magic Gaming here, and update 101 of Frosthaven brings some really cool news. The Frosthaven Rulebook. And there's a little bit more than just, hey, there's rules. There's a lot of subtle changes that I think we should go over. And it doesn't matter if you're playing a Banner Spear or a Bone Shaper or whatever. These rules will affect everyone and it gives us something to talk about while we wait for it. And it's only a few weeks away from Isaac hitting the big red button saying, go! And then hopefully we'll all be able to get our game and be able to enjoy it sometime this year. If you want to be kept up to date with all Frosthaven news, as well as have a lot of Frosthaven guys, be sure to subscribe. So before we go further, I do want to go into specifically talking about the playtester experience and what we've noticed over the course of playtesting and why there were some rule changes, because I think a few things just aren't going to make it into discussions based off of being talked about behind, as part of the development process. And I think those really enlightening things that we should be aware of. Battle goals is a small one, but you can now draw 3 instead of 2. And this is big for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's always really annoying when you get to a scenario, you get a battle goal, and then you draw 2 that are really difficult for your class. Just adding a third option reduces the randomness. Additionally, there's so many more battle goals now that getting through all of them and seeing new battle goals instead of the same ones over and over is harder if you're drawing less. So giving a bigger pool not only made people feel a little bit less screwed over if they got dealt some ones that didn't match their class very well, but also allowed people to see a larger variety of battle goals, and it just ended up being a better process over the whole course of campaign testing. I'd previously talked about the invisibility updates, and we've been made aware of that for several months now, but I think a lot of people don't understand the gravity of how non-loss invisibilities, and take a look at the starters and the amount of invisibility we have in there already. And you can see not only is there less invisibility, but with the rules change, it's not going to be something that people can reliably cheese anymore. And I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think there's I think a lot of people felt that the invisibility standing in a door was really gamey to begin with. Like, hey, I'm going to stand in a door and I'm just going to long rest while my guys just blast you from the other side, and then melee people just stand there and take it. They don't even try to go through the door because there's an invisible person there. It didn't even make sense thematically in any aspect. So that's a good change and I know there's a lot of things that are thematic that don't make sense anyway in Gloomhaven, so it's not the best approach, but it's nice that it fixes both a clearly obvious exploit and something that felt wonky when people were playing it. Another thing, take a look at the enhancement chart. Now you can see there's a few subtle changes. Disarm being removed entirely, Curse being more expensive, but also enhancing permanent enhancements is significantly more expensive, and being able to enhance losses for cheaper might incentivize that. Whereas there's a certain enhancement, just one in particular, that's lasts until the end of the scenario, permanent effect on one class. I think if you know that this jumping up in price, I think changes how some people chose to exploit that class, which is crazy that one enhancement completely changes one class. There's a similar card on the Banner Spear without a pip on that same kind of enhancement. So we clearly see going forward, we're not going to be doing things like that. But what I do like is this is actually going to incentivize people to get a few cheaper enhancements, and those really big ones that are super powerful really will cost a lot this time. Another thing, and I haven't seen this discussed too often, I think I saw it only on Reddit, but not on any of the other discussion areas, starting new characters after the campaign started. So if you have a fresh new character, it doesn't matter what level you start at, whatever your prosperity is will determine your starting gold. So you could choose to start at level 1 with a shit ton of gold, or level 3 with a shit ton of gold, it doesn't matter. However, any gold that you don't use during character creation is lost. Which is huge, because some people just use it to save up for a big item, or some people found ways to create characters and exploit. I don't know who gamed it like that, but I've heard some people at least ask questions like, what's stopping us from doing it? Like being clearly exploiting the system, just creating multiple characters just to get the gold. Anyway, but also notice that instead of you can make characters up to your prosperity, it's now half your prosperity. So you're not going to be creating like, oh, we hit prosperity 7, which honestly in the campaign, hitting prosperity 7 seems to happen fairly quickly. So you spent a lot of the last part of the campaign just at 7, 8, and 9. And you're like, man, we constantly have high levels. And as you retire and get new characters at the end, everyone's constantly this high level build, and it's not that great. And we noticed that with Frosthaven, which lasts even longer. A lot of the majority of the end of the campaign was just constant high level characters, even worse than Gloomhaven. And Gloomhaven, it kind of ends up, it works okay. But I think we could have implemented this in Gloomhaven as well. So that's something cool. So there's a little bit more balance in creating new characters after your initial ones. And I think this is something that's going to benefit the game going forward, because when it comes down to it, if you're stuck at Prosperity 7 for a long time, it means they're going to be any new characters coming in at level 4. Level 4 characters are going to be, they've got enough where you can pick really how you want to define your build, but they're also not super powerful, and it gives you time to grow over the course of the scenarios. So I personally think this is a much better design, and it was overwhelmingly supported by the playtesters, so I'm glad Isaac managed to implement this as part of it. I mean, I'd already knew that they chose that, but it was just wonderful that we are seeing some playtester feedback making positive changes on the Frosthaven rulebook. Something on the monster behavior that is more than invisibility too, by the way, is we found that multi-targeting has changed for ranged attacks. Now, a lot of people would find ways to game this by just being like, hey, I'm gonna get really close to you, and I'm gonna make this gap between the enemy, my friends, and I. So if you wanna do that multi-target, like there's some target 3 or target all within range. If people can remember the Living Spirit card that says that. Well, here's the thing. Sometimes people just get in range to where, like, if you get closer, there's no way you can attack you're gonna give disadvantage on me. So the guy just sits there and just one attack from afar, when he could have done 3 or 4 attacks. That's kind of wonky when you think about it. Like, they have this big bomb AoE and they only hit one guy because they really want to hurt that one guy. No more in Frosthaven, and this is a pretty significant buff for enemies, but there's not a lot of cards that do this. But the ones that do multi-attack, where they can move and then do a big explosion or multi-shot, they're way nastier, because they will now prioritize, instead of just their primary focus, try to hit as many enemies as possible. Whew. Another thing that I don't know if this has even been discussed at all, there's no move 0 to trigger effects anymore. Like infusions, you actually have to move 1 hex to get the effect. Now, this is probably not a big deal for most things, but let's say you have a card with move and infuse an element, or maybe it's got experience or yada yada yada. You have to actually perform at least 1 point of movement on the hex. The requirement to at least move 1 hex to get the benefit of playing the ability, I think, is probably underlooked. And it's something that a lot of people just did just because, on the Kabadamo card, like, hey, I'll do this effect and then I'll infuse Earth or something, whatever was on the card. But you actually have to do the 1 hex of movement now. And the Outpost Phase. The Outpost Phase is hugely different. Like, seriously. Also, it takes up so much space. Like, seriously, look at the Outpost. Oh my god. It's half of a Gloomhaven map. Just all in there. So what does the Outpost Phase do? It allows you everything you could have done in the city event, like the city phase, but you get an outpost event, which can have different effects, of course, and you have the Outpost Town Guard deck, and then the guards could potentially help defend Frosthaven, and you're going to need to improve your guard deck to make sure that you don't get, your buildings that you spend so much time into, letting them get wrecked. And that's a problem, because when they're wrecked, you can't use them. So let's say, you built an alchemy and you're like, yay, I can make potions, and then we can get to making stand potions. And then watching as an attack wrecks it. You have to kind of balance that. And I think one of the biggest things about the Outpost Phase is you craft items and brew potions, and you obviously like trade and buy items and craft and do all sorts of things you would normally do, do retirement and whatnot. But there's a little bit more development and cooperation, because your group as a whole figures out what buildings do you want to build and what do you want to aim for. And as a group, you have to contribute things, because any any items that you use for crafting, you can't use to advance Frosthaven. And I think just that little collaborative thing it's nice. Also, it kind of just as a bit of a note, it adds a little bit more spirit of cooperation, and I think Gloomhaven already had that, being a cooperative dungeon crawler, but now we've got a little bit more of that and that's to work together. Plus, you know, Frosthaven itself, you have to the whole place is in ruins when you get there, and you have to build it up and help the guards there, and the nice, wonderful introduction where you get introduced to the citizens that have survived the Ongox attacks, and just knowing full well, like, man, we need to save these people, kind of gives a little bit more of a, slightly more of a hero vibe than the mercenary vibe we got in Gloomhaven. Also, something to note, and I think people are generally aware of this from the Kickstarter, but the road events are themed for summer and winter, and you kind of have to prepare, because the winter road events, if you guessed it, are pretty awful, whereas the summer ones are generally par for the course of what people expected. So if you there's some scenarios that you might think are like, oh, this is a little hard, maybe tackle them in summer, because you'd hate to draw a terrible event on the way to that scenario. And speaking of difficult or complex scenarios, it's not necessarily a rule, but something that was introduced was the complexity rating for all scenarios. Now you can see on a scale of 1 to 3 just how difficult and complex and what other mechanics are in the scenario, because there are some scenarios that are just straightforward Black Barrow. You kick in the door right off the bat and just need to kill everything. There's no special rules, literally no special rules. It's just, hey, play Gloomhaven and step through the rules. Nothing special, no bosses, and pretty basic monsters. About as basic as you can get. However, of course, you have scenarios with constant rules, and I don't want to use spoilers here, but everyone can think of some scenario where it's like there's a lot to juggle. Although despite the fact we have the difficulty level from 1 to 3 in terms of complexity, we're not going to really see the return of a lot of the Forgotten Circles tier of difficulty in terms of complexity, because a lot of those were not only hard, but some of them really did have a lot of rules in them, and they wanted to scale that back because that was supposed to be a big challenge for people who thought they were really good at Gloomhaven. And Frosthaven's supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to be a step up in difficulty in terms of Gloomhaven. It's supposed to be, you know, just a tin charter, but all around it should be about the same. So there shouldn't be every scenario with oodles of special rules. Icy Terrain is a new terrain type that was mentioned in the Kickstarter, but the rules never really got much attention. So to talk about that though, Icy Terrain, whenever you move onto it, you must move 1 more hex. So it's basically you slip over it. The move's for free too, yay! However, also, if that moves you onto another icy hex, the chain continues. So if there's a big streak of line and you just like move 1 onto it, you can get catapulted to the end. So watch out. And yes, if you check some of the guest scenarios, some of them literally like that were submitted as part of the Frosthaven contest, there's some scenarios that are entirely in ice, and you have to do like a puzzle where you like slide the whole way, and it's hard. But it allows you to be a little bit more creative, and you can mitigate that with jump. Speaking of jump though, you saw the new rules for difficult terrain. It's bringing back what it brought back in Jaws. Jumping into difficult terrain doesn't cost 2, it costs 1 anymore. It just makes it easier, and I think a lot of the streamlining of rules makes it so there's less questions. And if you take a look at the rolling modifiers, that's improved. We already had a little bit of a sample of that, but it's basically advantage for players is just draw 2, pick 1, and then if there's rolling modifiers, it's always the draw until you get a non-rolling +1. That's the pretty simple thing for advantage or disadvantage. For disadvantage, draw until you hit a non-rolling modifier, then 1 more. Discard all the previous rolling modifiers, and on that last card you drew, the +1, ignore any rolling on it, compare the 2, and take the worst. For advantage, you do the same thing. You draw until you get 1 non-rolling modifier, then 1 more, and then you compare those final 2 cards you drew, and the final card you drew, you ignore the rolling modifier and just compare those 2. Then whichever one you pick, you add all the rolling modifiers to that result. Not a rule, but this snow fox is really tight. I love foxes. This one's pretty subtle, but the return of the Jaws of the Lion, there were some rules that clearly got to carry over from Jaws that they were testing them out, where we're getting the line of sight rules where it's any part of a hex, not just a corner. There's very, very few situations where this comes into play, but it's one of those where some people thought it was weird when you can like, well, I can draw a line here somewhere, but when you just take the corners, there's no line of sight. And I think there's just a few scenarios where it gets a little weird and it's confusing. It's always to do with the wall tiles, doors, and certain positioning that got a little strange. It's just easier to draw now. Ward, Brittle, and Impair are 3 new status effects. Impair had a little bit of a change. Previously required it to be healed off. Now it just lasts for the rest of return. Also got renamed from Injure. Personally think this is a huge better. I mean, honestly, Impair sounds more like Disarm, but I mean, what can you do? You already had Disarm as a status effect, but the inability to use items for a round is huge. Depends, because there's some scenarios where it's not going to matter, where you're like, oh, I don't have too many items, but there's some where it's just going to be awful, especially for certain monsters that constantly inflict Impair every time they attack. So you can imagine just getting that chain on you, and you have to find ways out of that. Ward cuts the next time you suffer damage in half, and it sounds really good, but honestly we haven't. I honestly just found like 2 or 3 was pretty common, an occasional 1. It didn't end up being like the big blobs of health we thought, boom, take half damage off the next hit. It's still, don't get me wrong, it's still good, but also it isn't valued super high in the system. In the game, so it's not like, oh, I got a big ward, cool, what's it do? It's not like as valued as high as some of the other status effects. So despite the fact it ends up not being super great, it still does some mitigation that's super good. And then Brittle. Now of course, Brittle is significant. It's because some people are like, oh, if I just take a weak attack, you never know if you're going to be like drawing that +2 and then having it be doubled, or like, you know, the crit if you don't have an iron helmet. And sometimes people end up losing cards over it. Now, there's a couple ways to cheese this. Number 1, if you're short resting and you want to take 1 damage to redraw, you can just take the 1 damage to redraw the card. Then it gets doubled to 2 and you lose Brittle, so it actually ends up doing 1 point of damage, which is nice. Also, if you're wounded, the wound does 2 damage instead of 1 and Brittle falls off. So if you find a way to wound yourself, that's one easy way out of Brittle. Last but not least is Bane. Bane usually ends up just being a target player loses a card. Most of the time we found out over the few times that enemies hit players with Bane is they did not want to suffer the 10 damage and just ended up eating the card. But then the coordinating, like, hey, I don't want to lose a card because if someone have a heal, or using their healing potion specifically for that. So it's still, that's suffer 10 damage is pretty big. However, being able to put this on enemies, and it's a little bit less restrictive because Gloomhaven had a handful of cards that just say kill that target. And Bane has kind of replaced that, but now a lot of those Bane targets still specify either normal or elite, but some of them are pretty nice. We won't get into those because they're going to spoiler territory. The grant action is pretty significant too, and I think this is one of those where I personally would reword some of the Gloomhaven classes to be grant, because grant is the controller controls it. So if you're like, hey, you brute, yeah, get a move 4, sweet, thanks, and you can just let him move 4. But if you're like, hey, Mind Thief, I'm gonna grant your rat a movement, and they're like, well, it's already next to a monster, what's it gonna do? Well, being able to control where your summons go is huge, especially with the Bone Shaper. Now, all the Bone Shaper cards have the grant keyword, so when you're granting these skeletons free movement, you now have the freedom control where they want. Now, of course, they still do the typical summon behavior on their turn, move towards the nearest melee focus using the same rules, but once you start granting them stuff, and there's a handful of cards that have that, once you start granting them movement, you get a little bit more control over them. It's the Banner Spear as well too, so that Banner Spear Bone Shaper combo still continues to be incredibly good and have a lot of synergy. Frosthaven introduces mandatory triggers, which is something that was already in the game, but they kind of had some rules like do not skip this part of a card if blah. And then they have this certain set of things like if it's negative, if it's an infusion, so on and so forth. Those are mandatory. Now there's no real anything except for like, here's the mandatory parts. The infusions are being put on the little corner of a card, so you can like see, hey, any elements I infuse are down here, and it's framed in the mandatory. But now instead of like, hey, does this, I'm gonna move 2 and then all adjacent allies and enemies suffer 1 damage. Is that a negative? So can I skip it or not? Blah, blah, blah. And there's no questions anymore. Does it have the mandatory trigger frame around it or not? If it's mandatory, it's mandatory. If not, you can skip it. Makes picking which abilities on a card you can play pretty easy. You can't skip any mandatory ones. It's just nice to have that clarity, because we had a handful of questions on like, is this considered negative? Can I skip this? And then they have to FAQ some of those. And another big thing is now you have a campaign overview. Now some people use like, Gloomhaven storyline or other ways to map out their campaign. Now you literally have a campaign board that shows you links from scenario to scenario. Not only gives you an idea of how you got there, because sometimes people went on like side quests, kind of like Skyrim, where you do all the side quests and you're like, where was I in the main story? How do we get here? Now you have a frame of reference on how you got from A to B, and so on and so forth. And just having that is nice. Also, just looking at the scenario board by itself, it doesn't seem to give you any spoilers. It just shows a bunch of arrows pointing every which way, and you're like, okay, that's cool. What does it even mean? You don't really know what it unlocks because it's all hidden, and the gives you some stickers to put everywhere. And there's so many stickers, but it's just, it's not. It gives you a little bit of framework as we progress through the campaign. And I think it's a little underrated. It's not really a rules change, but it's the idea that instead of like trying to search the Gloomhaven map, like, which of these have we done? Did we do this? Oh, like, no, I forgot to put a check on this. Now you literally have a board that shows what you've done and what you can do. And now we have a campaign sheet. I think this is important because in addition to the Outpost Phase, the event phase, and then the scenario, it's very reminiscent of Kingdom Death. Not saying that they copied off of it, because that's not necessarily a super original thing, but it's just interesting because like you go in scenarios, you get materials, you come back, and then you have to build up your settlement and buy upgrades. It's the same kind of resource mechanic in Kingdom Death, and I loved that. So being able to introduce that kind of a mechanic into Gloomhaven for Frosthaven is great, because Frosthaven already has great scenarios. I already love the gameplay. We don't need super fancy scenarios to make Frosthaven super great. And there are some more intricate ones, but they're not. The special rules don't really add up to huge numbers that get super confusing. However, we now have more nuance to the city thing. Because imagine in Gloomhaven, it was just like, all right, anyone want to buy anything? No, I just want to donate 10 gold to the tree. Cool. Anyone else? All right, let's go. And it just felt like you didn't have much attachment to it. But now you have to build it up, which is great. And we already went over it. Sounds a little bit more like heroic than mercenaries than you were in Gloomhaven. But now you have this cool Outpost Phase and this whole campaign tracker, which includes all the information you possibly could need to track, as it says, to track a campaign. And just because the out of combat part of Frosthaven has so much more depth. It's so much more rich than Gloomhaven. And you're going to be spending more time out of combat. It's not a huge amount, but there's going to be more decision making. There's going to be like, hey, where do we want to go? What resources can we contribute as a group that we want to save in Frosthaven? What do we want to build, and how do we want to advance this? And how retirements have a little bit more of a nuanced thing than some of the Gloomhaven ones. And I think that makes for a more compelling gameplay. It also makes you a little bit more attached to Frosthaven, and at least it happened with me. I don't know, maybe it won't happen with everyone. But those are some of the bigger changes. There's obviously more, and if there are, just let me know in the comments below and we can talk about it. And if there's some change that you do or don't like, let us know as well. I want to thank our patrons because you guys are all amazing. Thank you for supporting the channel. It really means a lot. And thank all of you for watching.